gangs and county lines. We're going to start by asking ourselves, what is a gang? Gangs have been part of our history for more than 2,000 years. In fact, they've probably been part of our history ever since we've had history. Certainly, in ancient Rome, Cicero complained about being harassed by street gangs and also spoke about their political significance in the life of the city. From the 1700s through to as late as the 1950s, the 40 Elephants gang were a notorious all-women shoplifting outfit operating across London. And the Peaky Blinders waged warfare, open warfare, across the streets of Birmingham through the late 19th and early 20th century. And these are just a few examples of street gangs and their action. The current statutory definition of a gang is provided in Section 51 of the Serious Crime Act. This revised the definition of gangs for the purposes of courts granting injunctions in order to prevent gang-related violence, drug dealing activity. So a gang is a group consisting of at least 3 people with one or more characteristics that enable its members to be identified by others as a group. Now, the statutory guidance on how to use or apply for these injunctions tells us that gang injunctions are intended to be used against members of violent street gangs. However, in order to set out what is meant by gang-related violence in legislation, it's a complicated task. In effect, no matter how you draw the definition, you nearly always wind up creating loopholes that certain activities and certain groups of individuals can then wriggle through. So the nature and form of gang-related violence varies significantly between areas and across types. It's not easily captured by a single definition. So the legislation is intentionally drawn very wide to allow the courts to grant injunctions against what's in effect a constantly changing form of criminality. But we as practitioners need a sound understanding of what gangs are and how they operate in order to satisfy the courts about the needs to apply injunctions. And also, if we're going to intervene in the lives of the vulnerable people most influenced by gangs, so as to do things for them, we need to know what it is we're dealing with. The real problem, I guess, with this legal definition is that it allows for almost anybody to be considered to be a gang member at some point. All of us get involved in groups of 3 or more people who could be identified by somebody else as a group. Whether that you could think for yourself of all the ridiculous ways in which we might think of, say, like the gang that meets at the bus queue or the gang who are waiting at the post office. That's obviously not what this legislation was intending, but we've drawn it so widely that in a way the definition is of no help to us to understand what's taking place in a gang. So I'm going to look backwards into the preceding definition and model of gangs that were used by the government. They based their ideas on a report written in 2009 by the Centre for Social Justice called Dying to Belong. This was a report drawing upon a range of evidence from expert witnesses, direct interviews with people in prison, gang members, families and community leaders who'd been affected and influenced by gangs, and also drawing upon a long-standing criminological tradition of gang research. So for Dying to Belong, a gang is a relatively durable, predominantly street-based group of young people who firstly see themselves and are seen by others as a discernible group. They also engage in a range of criminal activity and violence. They identify with or lay claim over territory. They have some form of identifying structural feature and are in conflict with other similar gangs. Now, I think even this definition lacks some sophistication that we're going to explore when we see it put together as a model. So the first thing we have to have is a group who see themselves and are seen by others as a discernible group. So there's the street gang, and they're populated by what the gang people call youngers and soldiers. So these are the individuals who we actually can see on the street. They engage in illegal, criminal and violent activities. The criminal activity that we're going to focus on predominantly is drug activities, although we might also think about other activity areas as well on other occasions. When we're thinking about the territory they operate across is obviously populated by people. Now, the territory, I don't think it's useful to just think in terms of a simplistic geographical area. For the purposes of drug activities, territories largely are to do with marketplaces. And marketplaces aren't necessarily continuous geographical areas. You might have a hub of street trading in drugs in a metropolitan centre like London, but that hub might also be supplying marketplaces in nearby county towns. So that the London street gang is supplying other parts of the country, and that sees that as all its own territory. That territory is occupied by people who aspire to be members of the gang. We refer to those as wannabes. But also people who don't particularly want to be associated with the gang, but for reasons of social exclusion, largely, become involved. So we refer to these as reluctant affiliates. And in both groups, both the wannabes and the reluctant affiliates, they will include, because the youngers and soldiers are largely male, they will, and it's a largely heterosexual culture, the wannabes and the reluctant affiliates include young women who either want to be part of the street gang through an emotional attachment, or are reluctantly part of the street gang through an emotional attachment. But essentially they are the emotionally attached young women who are partnered with one or more of the youngers and soldiers in the street gang. There should be some kind of identifying structural feature to the gang. So the first part of that is that the street gang youngers and soldiers, those who survive long enough, become recognised as faces and elders. They attain a degree of status that doesn't need to be constantly reasserted through street level activity. They acquire the degree of afforded respect that endures, so that they have authority within the street gang. They also provide the street gang with a buffer to the organised crime world. Now, organised criminals are interested in street gangs for lots and lots of reasons. We're going to look at just a couple of those in a minute or two. But they don't want to be necessarily closely associated with street gangs, because street gangs are very visible and therefore at risk of being arrested or marked and known to the police. So the organised criminal is not terribly interested in spending a lot of time with street gangs, and so the faces and elders provide a buffer between the two communities, as it were. Now, if we think about the drug activities, organised criminals import and produce, largely import, but there is some production as well, the kinds of drugs that are going to be distributed through street gangs. Street gangs, the distribution of drugs that we're interested in from street gangs, largely talking about heroin and crack. Significant amount of their business also in cannabis, but largely heroin, cracked cocaine, powder cocaine as well, amphetamines too. So the organised criminals import or produce these substances, and then the faces and elders are used as a distribution system for delivery by the youngers and soldiers, sometimes referred to as shooters as well, with propensity to carry guns. So the delivery system is the street gang on the street, and it very often leans upon the periphery of wannabes and reluctant affiliates in order to deliver and then take possession of the money for the drugs that they're trading in. Interestingly, this of course necessarily entails a degree of violence, because they're engaged in criminal activity and there's competition between street gangs. But the violence, the exposure to the risk of violence and the engagement in violence is highest at the bottom end of the hierarchy. Street gang youngers and soldiers engage in violence. The further away from the street you get, the less the violence, the less exposure to risk, the less you need to assert your status, because it's something that you've acquired historically. So that's what we mean by what a gang is, but what about this business with county lines? We know the phrase appears in the newspaper headlines. We know it's something that has been mentioned by the National Crime Agency and other Whitehall agencies as well. It's clearly something that's important, but sometimes it's not very clear what precisely a county line is, what it involves, or how it works. So we're going to have a quick look at that. First of all, why gangs use the phrase county line when describing drug distribution? It's a phrase that comes from American popular culture. It refers to jurisdictional boundaries at the county level. So this is within states. It's seen as a fairly petty level of administration. Local sheriffs have to observe the jurisdictional boundary of the county line. It's often cited in popular culture where local law enforcement attempts to prohibit the sale and distribution of liquor. So I remember as a child hearing the phrase county line referred to in advertising for Libby's fruit juice drink called moonshine. And the individuals who are involved with the county line have this kind of, they like the plucky, adventurous individuals who are resisting the domineering, joyless state, so that they are the smugglers and highwaymen. They have this kind of romance associated with them. They're individuals who pursue the distribution of fun, I guess. And that's quite useful for the purposes of the gang, because that kind of glamour and romance gets attached to the figure of the gangster. So here's Tupac, who to some extent has been almost canonized, almost turned into a saint of the rap culture and the street gang culture because of his glamour, because of his association with this kind of rugged, individualistic, romantic resistance to authority. This doesn't in any way directly address it. It effaces the fairly grim realities of street gang life. So let's think about the structure and function of the street gang to see how that romanticised image of the gangster fits in with it. So there's the model, as you recall. This is the part that we're most interested in, this distribution and delivery. These are the activities with the highest levels of exposure and the greatest potential for variation between gangs. Individual gangs manage distribution and delivery in their own ways. Organised crime groups keep themselves at a distance from these things because they're risky. They expose you to the interests of the police, but also to the violent activities of other street gangs. So they need that distance in order to have stability, in order to be organised as organised criminals. But they also need to maintain control over their distribution networks in order to protect their profits and their marketplaces. So county lines are a mechanism to provide this distance and control through carefully protected telephone numbers promoted as brands to users purchasing drugs. You can see the reality of what a county line is a long way from the romantic image of the sort of smuggler moving fun from place to place in defiance of the oppressive state. So essentially, these phone numbers and the marketplaces that they've come to represent are the county lines. Street gangs of shooters and soldiers, faces and youngers, elders and associated wannabes and girlfriends. These are all just infrastructure that distribute and deliver the drugs traded via the county lines. But the county line has acquired the mystique and the romance associated with smuggling, as it were, or highwaymanship, so that the individuals who are involved in these things feel that they are able to see themselves as other than merely the mules and runners of organised criminals. So this is how it works. Users looking to purchase drugs place orders by ringing the county line number. Now, the number has been distributed via word of mouth largely in the past, although increasingly we're seeing other forms of promotion and advertising. For example, business cards and flyers, which some people regard as fairly audacious, although to my mind the use of social networks and media are probably even more audacious. Relatively high-level organised criminal gang members hold the county line. Now, the number that they hold is very, very fiercely protected, because in this world, individual faces, individual elders, certainly the soldiers and youngers of gangs, are expendable. They get killed, they get arrested, they move in and out of the gang. They're not a reliable feature of the distribution system, but the number is, and it represents the continuity of service. And also, to some extent, it represents a level of quality assurance. So this high-level criminal gang member then makes decisions about how orders are going to be managed. It promotes certain deals like loss leading with cut price offers for new customers. It also agrees the terms for distribution via local elders and faces. So the faces and elders get these kind of instructions from the criminal organisation, and they handle the orders by taking the relay and passing it on to the younger members of the group, the youngers and shooters and soldiers. So they collect and distribute the drugs that are being carried from metropolitan centres to rural or urban areas. So the youngers carry the drugs and also then distribute them and take possession of the cash and bring the cash back to the places where the elders and faces can then consolidate it and pay for the purchase of the drugs. In doing this, of course, the youngers and the soldiers very often are leaning on and exploiting the peripheral network of wannabes and girlfriends, and also the reluctant affiliates as couriers, and they provide storage places as well, or also retail venues or accommodation for gang members who are moving between the metropolitan hub and the rural outlying areas of the marketplace of the territory. So this network provides rapid response to demand It's backed up by a reliable strategy set of coercion and exploitation, and it keeps the highest status participants at low exposure to risk and a secure distance from the most visible forms of criminal behaviour without compromising on the reliable nature of the marketplace. So that county line is carefully protected phone number because it represents the security of the criminal organisation and also the reliability of supply to the user. We're going to have a quick final finish now with the strategies of coercion and exploitation that underpin this whole thing. So I've got 3 strategies that I'm going to look at. There's cuckooing, grooming and debt bondage. First of all, grooming is the process of establishing an emotional bond with a vulnerable person. We often think about children being groomed for sexual exploitation, but really any kind of exploitative behaviour of vulnerabilities could be thought of in terms of grooming. So grooming may be reinforced with gifts and threats of exposure once exploitation has occurred. Once you've groomed somebody and encouraged them into some kind of, say, illegal or unacceptable behaviour, you can then threaten to expose them to people who care about their status. But initially, the key thing is that the person who grooms the vulnerable person pays attention and is perceived to be of a relatively high status. We all crave the attention of higher status individuals. It's a kind of built-in group psychology thing in humanity. This sort of manipulation is often accompanied by efforts to isolate the vulnerable person from sources of support, families, friends, and services, suggesting that these people want to control or disempower or infantilise the victim, which is kind of ironic, I guess, because that's precisely what the motive of those exploiting the vulnerable is. Let's think about cuckooing now. This is where the gang would target vulnerable adults in order to exploit their place of residence for storing and selling drugs or accommodating gang members or weapons or other contraband. Whereas grooming is about acquiring and protecting human resources, cuckooing is about acquiring and to some extent protecting material resources, physical property, places where we can stay, trade, deal and collect resources together. Vulnerable adults may be groomed or coerced through debt bondage, and that's the final thing we're going to look at. The thing is that they're separate from the desire. What's wanted in cuckooing is the place, not the person. So debt bondage is a form of control whereby victims are forced to do things in lieu of goods or services. So once we've identified a vulnerable person who has property that we want to use, for example, we can then introduce them to drugs, hopefully get them hooked, persuade them that they now owe us for the use of the drugs that we've given them. Or maybe that drugs have gone missing whilst we've been at their property and therefore they are somehow responsible for those missing drugs and they've got to help, they've got to do something to help out. So the debt bondage is basically, it's about persuading the victim that they owe you something in lieu of money for goods and services that you have or should have received. Street gangs often use debt bondage to coerce reluctant affiliates, the people who are not keen on being members of the gang, into illegal activities like transporting and storing drugs or weapons, or providing accommodation for gang members or clients, or in more advanced settings, providing accommodation for prostitution or other illegal activities that the gang is involved in. Essentially, these strategies are about coercing and exploiting the vulnerable. So if we do wish to intervene in the lives of those affected by gangs, one of the things that we've got to make ourselves most conscious of are the vulnerabilities that are targeted for exploitation by gangs.